August 14, 2005. Over the mountains of Athens, Greece, two F-16 fighter jets were ordered to intercept a Boeing 737 passenger plane. As the fighter pilots approached the aircraft, through the windows, what they saw made their spines shiver. Passengers were wearing oxygen masks but sat motionless, collapsed in their seats. Inside the cockpit, the captain was nowhere to be seen. Instead, a mysterious figure was trying to control the plane. What exactly had happened on this flight? And who was the mysterious person in the cockpit? Hello everyone, I'm Chechi. In this video, I will tell you a heavy and tragic story about human error and the struggle for life and death. On the blue waters of the Eastern Mediterranean lies a jewel-like island nation, Cyprus. Blessed by the Mediterranean climate, the sun shines brightly here and the sea breeze is gentle. Every summer, tourists from all over Europe come here to enjoy a leisurely vacation. Helios Airways, a low-cost airline focused on holiday charters, was born here to meet this growing demand. As business grew, Helios Airways introduced its third Boeing 737 in 2004. But this aircraft, however, was a second-hand 737 leased from Germany and had been plagued with problems from the start, constantly suffering from various malfunctions. In December 2004, the aircraft suddenly experienced explosive decompression midair. The rear right door seal failed and the air blasted a hole in it. The aircraft underwent major repairs, but it was like a used car that could never be fully fixed. One moment it was the electronic cooling system failing. The next it was the pressurization system breaking down. It spent far more time grounded in the hangar for repairs than soaring in the sky. On the night before the incident, this aircraft was operating a charter flight from London to Cyprus. Shortly after takeoff, a series of banging noises came from the right rear door. The door's sealing strip also showed signs of icing. With this malfunction, the plane flew through the night of August 14th and landed safely in Cyprus. As soon as it touched down, the captain requested engineers to perform a full inspection of the aircraft. This task was assigned to Helios Airways chief engineer, Alan Irwin. This British engineer had previously worked for several major airlines. As for this plane, he was already very familiar with its problems. It was obvious the right rear door sealing was once again faulty. Alan gathered his team and, following the maintenance manual, began a ground pressurization test. In normal flight, the pressurization of the cabin is automatically controlled according to altitude. To ensure passengers fly comfortably, the plane begins pressurizing the cabin after takeoff to simulate a lower altitude and ensure oxygen supply. Without starting the engines, they turned on the APU, the auxiliary power unit, to provide power to the aircraft's air conditioning system. He then closed the outflow valve and set the pressurization panel switch to manual mode. In this way, the aircraft on the ground could simulate the pressurization environment of high altitude. After about half an hour, the pressure differential reached 8.25 psi. The two engineers outside the plane heard no sound of air leaking from the right rear door. Alan concluded the aircraft had no sealing issues. In his maintenance record, he wrote, "No known defects, no leaks, no unusual noises. The aircraft passed the test." However, after the test, they forgot to switch the pressurization mode knob back from manual to automatic. This small oversight was about to rewrite the fate of 121 people on board. At around 8 a.m., 2 pilots and 4 flight attendants boarded the plane and began preparing for the route. Helios Airways had scheduled the flight to Athens, the capital of Greece, and then onward to Prague, the capital of the Czech Republic. The 2 pilots in the cockpit were 58-year-old Captain Hans-Jürgen Merten, with 10 years of experience, and 51-year-old First Officer Pampos Karalumbus, also with 10 years of experience. Together, these seasoned pilots had logged over 23,000 flight hours. Because several flight attendants had called in sick that day, Helios had to call in a standby attendant, Andreas Prodromou, who was on leave, to temporarily fill the gap. At first, Andreas didn't want to come in, but his girlfriend, Haris Chera-Lambaus, happened to be on the same flight. So this flight attendant, who also held a private pilot license, eventually agreed to join the Helios flight crew. As 115 passengers began boarding, the 2 pilots in the cockpit were carrying out their pre-flight preparations. They had to check each switch from left to right and from top to bottom on the overhead panel to ensure that all the aircraft systems were in their correct working condition. Among these checks was the pressurization mode selector knob. Because the Helios flight was already delayed during boarding, the two pilots rushed through the cockpit preparations. Neither of them noticed that the pressurization mode knob was still set to manual instead of the required automatic position. If the two pilots had carefully followed the checklist, there was no way they could have missed such a serious issue. It seems the crew mechanically went through the checklist confirmations without actually verifying the real status of each system. Perhaps they didn't even run the checklist at all. A procedure meant to safeguard flight safety was reduced to a mere formality. At 8:07 a.m., Helios Airways Flight 522 began its takeoff roll down the runway. Soon this aircraft, bearing the Golden Sun logo, soared into the skies like Helios' chariot of the sun, racing toward the heavens. 5 minutes later, Flight 522 had already climbed to 10,000 feet and was cleared to ascend to its cruising altitude of 34,000 feet. Passengers gazed out the windows, admiring the breathtaking views of Cyprus, unaware of the sharp pain beginning in their eardrums. The cabin was not pressurized at all, and the air was growing thinner and thinner. Inside the cockpit, the pressurization mode's green light on the manual setting was still alerting the pilots to a critical issue. The cabin altitude indicator clearly showed the rapidly rising altitude. Yet as the pilots carried out the after-takeoff checklist, they still failed to notice this critical problem. As the aircraft kept climbing, a preventable disaster was quietly taking shape. When the plane reached 12,500 feet, the cabin altitude had risen to 10,000 feet. This was already beyond the safe limit for normal flight. Inside the cockpit, the piercing cabin altitude warning suddenly sounded. The alarm tone was identical to the takeoff configuration warning, but the takeoff configuration warning should only sound on the ground. However, Captain Hans mistook the cabin altitude warning for a takeoff configuration warning. Neither the captain nor the first officer put on their oxygen masks, nor did they check the knob that had been mistakenly set to manual pressurization mode. Instead, the captain disconnected the autopilot, then re-engaged it, then disconnected the auto throttle, and reduced engine thrust. These were all actions meant to address a takeoff configuration warning, but they could not silence the cabin pressurization alarm. As the plane continued to climb, the avionics cooling system, deprived of normal airflow, also triggered a warning. Yet Captain Hans still did not realize that the aircraft had lost pressurization. He contacted headquarters by radio for help. The person who responded was Alan Irwin, the very engineer who had earlier forgotten to reset the knob to auto. Captain Hans's English was not very good. What he intended to say was that 2 indicator lights for the shutdown alert system had illuminated, but instead he said that 2 equipment cooling lights had not lit up. On the ground, Alan Irwin couldn't understand why the captain was worried about lights that were supposed to be off, and he reassured him that this was normal. While they were conversing, the aircraft climbed to 14,000 feet. The passenger oxygen warning light came on in the cockpit, and masks automatically dropped in the cabin. These masks could provide about 12 minutes of oxygen, just enough time for the aircraft to descend to a safe altitude after repressurization. But the 2 pilots paid no attention to these warnings. The alert that the cabin had lost pressure was ignored. Instead, they allowed the aircraft to continue climbing and focused on troubleshooting the avionics cooling system fault. On the ground, Alan Irwin found the captain's questions increasingly puzzling. He suspected that Hans might have mistaken the manual pressurization mode indicator light for the equipment cooling warning light. "Can you confirm that the pressurization panel is set to auto?" he asked. But by then, the captain was already suffering from severe hypoxia. Instead of answering, he asked Alan where the circuit breaker for the cooling system was. By this time, Helios Flight 522 had climbed to 29,000 feet, an altitude close to the summit of Mount Everest. The body's oxygen consumption now exceeded what it could absorb. For anyone without mountaineering training, in such rapidly changing hypoxic conditions, unconsciousness comes swiftly. Captain Hans stood up and left his seat to search for the circuit breaker, but he collapsed in the cockpit due to hypoxia and never woke up again. First Officer Pampos also fainted in his seat. By the time the morning sun shone on Helios 522, The aircraft had reached 34,000 feet. With no one at the controls, it followed the autopilot's commands, cruising steadily at 10,000 meters. Meanwhile, the emergency oxygen in the passenger's mask had already run out. Inside the cabin, at minus 40 degrees Celsius, passengers were succumbing to both hypoxia and hypothermia. Unless the two pilots somehow regained consciousness, what awaited everyone on board was endless darkness.